Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we will be analysing the character of Dr. Henry Jekyll in Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. If you haven't already, check out my 7-minute animated summary linked in the description below for a quick recap of the plot of the story. Henry Jekyll is the central character in this novella, and through him, Stevenson portrays the duality of human nature, the conflict between personal desires and societal norms, and the potential dangers of intellectual hubris. This complex mix of characteristics is revealed through Jekyll's actions in the story, and in his reflections in the letter to Mr. Utterson. Jekyll is a firm believer that humans have a dual nature inside of them, or a good side and a bad side. As a respected physician and gentleman in Victorian society, he is very much aware of the importance of reputation and social standing. In fact, at this time in history, reputation was pretty much everything, and there was huge pressure from society to conform to their expectations. But because he is expected to behave a certain way in public, he says that, "I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life." This duplicity comes from his desire to do things which were deemed unacceptable by society at that time, without tainting his perfect reputation. There are many ways to interpret what exactly it is that Jekyll is trying to hide from society, as he never explicitly tells us what his pleasures are, but instead uses cryptic words and phrases such as a certain impatient gaiety of disposition and undignified irregularities. When he first transforms into Hyde, Jekyll says that he had a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, which seems to suggest that the acts of which he was ashamed were of a sexual nature. One reading of this text is that Stevenson wrote Jekyll's character to be homosexual, which at that time was illegal in the UK, and would have been considered indecent, especially for an upper-class gentleman. Therefore, he would have been forced to repress his sexuality and hide it from society, or risk losing everything. In this novella, all of Jekyll's social circle seem to be unmarried men, and initially when Mr. Utterson is investigating his relationship with Mr. Hyde, he assumes that Jekyll is being blackmailed by him for the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace. So it is possible that he believes Jekyll is trying to cover up a homosexual relationship from his youth. On the other hand, Jekyll also says in his letter that many a man would have even blazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of. Blazoned meaning to display prominently or vividly, and it is unlikely that many gay men in Victorian society would have felt comfortable displaying their sexuality openly, as it was still seen as a crime and something to be ashamed of. But whatever his pleasures were, Jekyll feels forced to repress them and project the persona of a perfect, respectable gentleman, and it is this pressure from society which leads to his experiments to separate the two parts of his character, eventually creating Mr. Hyde, who is a physical embodiment of his so-called darker impulses. Therefore, the transformation of Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde can really be seen as a metaphor for the conflict between societal expectations and personal desires. Jekyll sums up this internal battle by saying, "Man is not truly one, but truly two," as Hyde represents the suppressed side of Jekyll's personality, the parts of him that are not considered acceptable by society, but are parts of him all the same. Stevenson observed this same duality of nature in the world around him, as it is widely believed that Jekyll's character was inspired by John Hunter, a well-respected doctor in 18th century London, who was known for hosting lavish parties at his house for his upper-class social circle. However, there was another side to Hunter's house, which opened up onto a small alleyway, and through this back entrance he would deal with grave robbers who brought him corpses to experiment on. The layout of this house is a visual representation of the Doctor's duality, and definitely has similarities to Jekyll's house, with a respectable, fashionable side to present to the world, but a hidden laboratory in the back to conduct his ethically questionable experiments. Although Jekyll is successful in creating a physical alter ego in the form of Mr. Hyde, he eventually loses control over him, which perhaps is Stevenson's way of warning readers about the dangers of giving in to their darker impulses. Initially, he is able to decide when and where he transforms into Hyde by drinking the potion he concocted, and uses it as a way to escape from his respectable persona and free his hidden desires. However, as time goes by, he admits to noticing a shift in control. I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. This gradual loss of control over his transformations symbolizes the takeover of his animalistic instincts, which he believed he could contain. There is a clear link here to the Freudian theory of the id and ego, with Jekyll representing the ego and Hyde the id. According to Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, the human personality is made up of different elements, the id, ego, and superego. The id is essentially our instinctive and primitive behaviors, basic desires such as needing to eat, drink, or have sex, and is driven by what is called the pleasure principle, the drive to fulfill those desires as soon as possible. However, the ego allows us to balance these instincts by using rational thought and logic. For instance, the id part of our personality would tell us that we are hungry and need to eat, but the ego part is what stops us from doing it right away if we are not in an appropriate situation, like in a work meeting or in class. The superego goes a step further, however, and incorporates the morals and social behaviors we learn from our parents and our peers. It operates on the morality principle, being good for the sake of being good, and accepted by society. This is all extremely relevant in the case of Jekyll and Hyde, as Jekyll is clearly motivated by his ego and superego to adhere to the standards of perfection set out for him by society, and restrain his baser id instincts. Once he gives in to his id, however, it quickly spirals out of hand, and he eventually loses the ego and superego parts of his personality altogether, and with them, all sense of morality. The theme of morality and responsibility plays a huge role in Jekyll's narrative, as his experiment, which at first seems like a breakthrough in understanding human nature, becomes more and more of a moral dilemma, as Hyde's actions grow increasingly violent and nasty. Jekyll acknowledges this, saying that Hyde is a being inherently malign and villainous, his every act and thought centered on self. However, although he recognizes the possible dangers of transforming into Hyde, he still returns to that form again and again, which suggests that his sense of morality is slowly being worn away. Because he can go back to being Jekyll whenever he chooses, he fails to take responsibility for the actions of his alter ego, as he assumes that he will never have to be held accountable for them. Jekyll's intellectual curiosity and hubris blind him to the potential moral consequences of his experimentation. In Victorian society, people were predominantly Christian, and would have seen his pursuit of scientific knowledge and unethical experiments as an attempt to play God. In fact, he and his old friend Dr. Lanyon have a falling out over this very subject, as he disapproves of the moral and ethical boundaries that Jekyll is crossing. Stevenson deliberately uses words that are associated with witchcraft when describing the creation of Hyde, as he wants to relay to the reader that what he is doing goes against Christian beliefs and principles. He calls Hyde a familiar, which is a supernatural creature, usually in the form of an animal, that assists a witch and does her bidding. Additionally, he says, "Late one accursed night, I compounded the elements and watched them boil and smoke," a phrase which definitely brings to mind a boiling witch's cauldron. Because he underestimates the consequences of his actions, he initially fails to grasp the severity of the situation he has created, and turns a blind eye to what Hyde gets up to. But once Sir Danvers is murdered, the reality of the monster he has let loose sinks in, and he has a sense of horror when he realizes what he has done. Henry Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fallen upon his knees and lifted his clasped hands to God. In an attempt to make up for the sins of Hyde, he throws himself into charity and religion, trying to amplify the good parts of his character with these acts, but he soon discovers how naive he was to believe that he could cast off Hyde so easily. Despite his disregard for moral consequences, however, it is hard to see Jekyll as anything but a tragic figure, as his downfall is a direct result of his own choices and actions. Regardless of what he initially intended when he created Hyde, Jekyll's inability to control his alter ego leads to murder and tragedy. He acknowledges this sad end when he signs off his letter to Utterson, saying, "Here then, as I lay down this pen and proceed to seal up my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end." His decision to end his own life is a culmination of his failure to reconcile the good and evil parts of himself, and this whole narrative can be seen as a cautionary tale by Stevenson about the consequences of not recognizing and controlling the so-called bad side of our personalities. However, we could also interpret this story as the result of an overly harsh and restrictive society that puts so much pressure on people to be perfect and maintain their social image that they are forced to repress their true natures and potentially lead to darker and more explosive consequences. So, what do you think? Does all the blame lie with Jekyll for not staying in control of his vices, or is it the fault of society? Or a mixture of both? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, guys! Stay tuned for follow-up analysis videos soon to come. See you next time!